Welcome back. So in this video, we'll be talking about the many influences on human behavior. This is an ambitious topic to cover because obviously there's a lot of influences. And so what we're trying to do here is to broadly categorize some of those differences or think of ways we can kind of think about groups of those differences together, kind of give some structure to this broad topic. And so before we get into that, just recapping, in our last video, we talked about what psychology is, right? So it's a study of human behavior and mental processes. So in other words, what we're trying to answer today is what are the things that influence our behavior and mental processes? And one way we can think about this broadly is something called, or is through this image here, something called the Indigenous Ecological Systems Model. And I want to include this here because for starters, I think it's important to note that in psychology, we're focused on individuals, right? Individual human beings. But if we think about individuals without any sort of context, then we're missing a very big piece of the picture, right? So it's kind of the point I'm trying to make in this video today. And so in this model here, we have the individual at the center. And you can see that within the individual are some systems that have influenced the individual, and then we also have some systems outside the individual that are going to influence it as well, right? And so if we think about the individual as, I'll just use myself as an example, I guess, because that's easy. If we think about the individual as me here, and then there are all these core psychological phenomena, right? So I might be happy, might be sad, might be having various thoughts, various feelings, so on and so forth. Well, those are going to be influenced by some things from my own personal history, obviously, right? Such as my culture, right? Cultural factors would call as part of this macro system. So those patterns in our lifestyles, beliefs, ideologies, customs, opportunity structures, so on and so forth, that have influenced me. The chrono system here contains historical factors. So what are some of the things that go back within my lifetime and even before my lifetime that have shaped who I am today? Like, for example, I was born and raised in Kansas, but I am not indigenous to Kansas, or rather, my family is not indigenous to Kansas. If you look back far enough in history, right? I am white and I am not a Native American, right? And so there were all the events, yeah, with colonization, with immigration, all the things that have happened that led me to be born in Kansas in 1991, right? So it's kind of one example of historical factors that influence us. Your parents' experiences, grandparents' experiences, how your parents were raised as children themselves is obviously going to have some impact on how they raise you, right? So on and so forth. So those intergenerational effects, which we'll talk more about this semester, can kind of be captured there. I think I'm rambling, so I'll be faster on this. So the point is, there are these things within us, our culture, our history, that influence our experiences as a person, as a human. And then within our lifetime, there are also, or within our lifetime and before our lifetime, there are also these factors that are external to us, right? So the microsystem is this immediate environment. And so this you can think of as various patterns in our life, like the roles we have. For example, I am your instructor in this course, but I'm also a human being outside of this, right? I am a son, I am a brother, I am an uncle, I am a partner, to, partner meaning like my girlfriend, right? Like I'm a romantic partner, I'm a friend, I'm a coworker, right? All these roles that we can have and the people we interact with, and that's obviously going to affect us as well. The exosystem, then, that distal environment, these are things that go sort of further beyond that really close environment of ours. So if you think about, for example, um, or I guess another way to describe this is things where we're not actively participating in them. So, for example, I vote, but beyond that, I'm not really involved in politics. I'm not running for office. I'm not making laws, but I am bound to those laws because of the judicial systems that are in place. Right? If I go tearing down the highway to Anchorage at 120 miles an hour, guess what? I'm probably going to get pulled over and get a ticket if the cops are out that day because there are these laws in place that affect us and our behavior, right? So it's kind of one example of what we mean by exosystem. And then the mesosystem is kind of the in between, right? Yeah, some things that um, are still more distant, but are still salient to the individual. So, for example, if we think about interactions between some of those immediate environments, right? So, for example, I know like when I'm thinking like my college graduate, or let me think actually, like when I graduated from graduate school, it was kind of a weird experience for me because people were interacting, uh, loved ones, right, friends, family, so on and so forth. Some people were interacting that had never really met each other in person before, but they were still very important parts of my life. It's kind of one example of that mesosystem there. Um, so I was probably rambling, but point is here is that there are all these different things we should consider. Um, and we shouldn't just look at the individual without any context. But nonetheless, in psychology, we're still looking at the individual. Other fields study those systems more explicitly, like sociology, economics, ethnic studies, so on and so forth. I almost deleted this, but I wanted to include it. If you'd like to kind of have some interactive exercises as you go through this, I encourage you to pause this and sort of work through this prompt. I won't read it out loud to you. So feel free to pause there. And then some additional note taking that you can do here. Oh, actually, let me move forward to that. Okay, so yeah, if you'd like to, go for it. If not, we'll carry on. Another way I like to think about this is through this graphic that I created. This is something from when I taught another class called personality. I developed this to try to kind of capture all these different theories and ideas in one place. There's a lot going on here, so let's break this down. So first, let's look at the biology of individuals, right? So those are our physiological aspects of our body as living beings that influence or relate to our psychology, right? So, for example, our anatomy and physiology, right? So, our brain, body parts, and functions. That's obviously going to affect my behavior. Like, for example, um, I think I'll cover this in the next module. There was someone named Phineas Gage. He was a railroad worker. This was like 150 years ago or something like that. Um, Long story short, he was working on a railroad. There was a tragic accident, and a railroad spike shot up through his head and out, or up through his head underneath his cheek, and then out the top of his head, sort of right above the eyes. And he lived, but his personality fundamentally changed because of damage to the frontal lobe of his brain. Right? We need an intact brain to function um, at our most capable. I guess maybe that's not the right way to put it. To function as our typical self. We'll put it that way, right? The brain we're born with, we need that to function as our typical self. And damage to that obviously is going to affect how we behave, how we think. Our biochemistry, so neurotransmitters, hormones, right? Those hormones, for example, are something that can naturally fluctuate through the seasons, through our own individual cycles, right? So that's something that's obviously going to affect us. Our genetics, right? So the DNA that we're born with, the experiences of our ancestors that have, to some extent, been embedded in our DNA, right? These are all things that can influence our experiences as humans. Cognition here referring to our mental activity, right? So the ways we acquire new information, the way we store information, the way we use the knowledge and information that we have. And as we learn new things, we'll behave and think differently. One example there is language, which we'll get to more later in this course. One story to give an example there. A sister, yeah, I was going to say a sister of mine, but I only have one sister. My sister was in the Peace Corps in a Spanish-speaking country when she was younger, and she became very fluent in Spanish, and she was speaking Spanish consistently. And it was really interesting to see from the outside perspective because her English got noticeably worse, and she started dreaming and thinking in Spanish because essentially that was the information she was using. And that's kind of a trippy thought. If you speak or know more than one language, you can probably relate to the fact that languages don't always directly translate. And in many ways, the language we have can shape and influence our thinking and how we perceive the world and think of ourselves. Right. So just kind of one example there. But if you think about going through college, right, as you learn this new information, you'll probably think about things differently when you graduate than you did when you just started college. Affect, this is a broad term, but generally speaking refers to um, basically our emotionality, our emotions. And this can be a trait or a state. So some people refer to affect as a trait. So it's kind of our characteristic emotional tendency. Some people tend to be fluctuate in emotion more. Some people tend to be more baseline. Some people tend to be a little bit more, I guess, of a downer. Some people have more of a flat affect. Some people are naturally just more happy, more positive, right? These are things that we can fluctuate on. And it can also be a state, right? So we can have different moods, right? We're human beings. Some days we have good days, some days we have bad days, right? And so obviously our emotions are going to affect our experiences in the world. And to some extent, emotions can even affect how we think. For example, if we're in a really good mood, we tend to have an easier time remembering positive things and we interpret the world in a more positive way. Whereas if we're in a bad mood, it's actually a little bit easier to remember um, bad things or depressing things or whatever it may be, and we might interpret the world in a more negative or maladaptive way, right? So kind of some examples there. And if it helps to give you a little bit more context here, affect we kind of think as, or actually let me put all this up here. If you think of affect as kind of our baseline, what we tend to fall back to, so if this arrow just represents time, this isn't a very good picture now that I look at it, but if this arrow represents time, right, within that, this little black section, we can have different moods, right? Like, for example, yesterday I was just in a bad mood, honestly. I wasn't having a good day. Um, and within that mood, I also have discrete emotions, right? And so you can kind of think of emotions are more of the feelings we have in any sort of given moment or collection of moments. Mood is sort of a longer collection of moments over a longer period of time, like a day, an evening, a couple days, whatever it may be. And then affect generally refers to our overall trait-like emotional experiences or emotional baseline. Okay, yeah, we just covered that one. And these things obviously don't operate in isolation, right? These are all aspects of people, right? And sometimes they can be combined, right? So, for example, um, an attitude, if you hear people say like, drop the attitude, lose the tude, right? Whatever it may be, attitude in psychology we refer to as sort of some overall evaluation that consists of both feelings and thoughts, right? So, like, what's an example there from my experience? I guess I'll just use I'll use romance as an example there. So, for example, my girlfriend, right? I love my girlfriend, and that is a result of the feelings that I have for her, the baseline emotion that comes with love, right? And I'm not very poetic, so I won't try to elaborate on that more in this moment on the spot. But there's certainly an emotional component to that, and there's also a cognitive component to it, right? Just having memories of our past experiences, and through that, I formed an understanding, and I believe that she will be there for me. She is supportive. We can talk through things, right? And so, just one example of the fact that these things don't operate in isolation, right? Typically, it's some combination of these things. Or when we think about humanity and human beings, um, it's usually not just one of these things. Rather, they're all sort of connected. Just like I don't have an example, but our biology and affect are directly related, right? Sometimes we can be in crappy moods because our biology's off. I used to work with kids. I remember one day we had a kid who was always very pleasant and happy, but he was just a complete downer and depressed, and I'd never seen him like that before. And then the next day when he came in, he was happy again. We asked the mom, "Is everything okay? What was going on?" Come to find out, his blood sugar was low, and he never had a history of that before, right? And because his blood sugar was low, it dramatically affected his overall emotional state and mood and so on and so forth, right? So just hopefully making the point that right, these are all sort of interconnected. And obviously our behavior, right, is the things that we do, right? Our observable actions, we've covered that. And our behavior is going to affect our environment, which is also going to give us feedback, right? So yeah, so the environment can influence us to think, feel, or act in certain ways, such as through reinforcement and punishment. Um, right, like I'll use myself as an example again. When I was in preschool, this is honestly like one of the only memories I have of preschool. I don't know what that says about me. It stuck out, I guess. I guess I didn't like getting in trouble. But I had this one toy truck that I loved playing with, and one day another girl in the class was playing with the truck, and obviously I was upset because that's my truck, and I always play with this truck. So I went and took it from her, And then our teacher, Miss Gale, got very upset with me, and I sat in timeout, and then I shared my toys with my classmates after that, right? Because I learned my lesson. I was like, okay, I know I'm not supposed to do this. The consequence of the environment, in this case, it was a person, my teacher, Mrs. Gale. The consequence of not being able to play with my truck and not being able to play at all, I had to go sit in timeout, taught me that I shouldn't act that way, right? So the consequence changed my behavior, right? So this is sort of like an ongoing feedback loop. Oh, yeah, there you go. Children learn how to behave based on what behaviors are rewarded or punished by their elders and caretakers. And within the environment, there's a lot to that, obviously. And so we can think of this in, broadly speaking, I think of this in two ways. So the physical environment refers to the place and conditions that we find ourselves in, right? So, um, for example, the climate, right? Like if you live in Alaska, it's very obvious to you. This is obvious elsewhere in the world, but especially obvious in Alaska that the seasons can affect our mood, right? And the amount of daylight we receive can affect our mood, right? Like in the winter, it's just dark. You're not getting that vitamin D. It's really easy to want to sleep in, to cozy up, watch a movie, read a book, whatever it may be. Whereas in the summer, when the sun is constantly shining, um, that there's more of a feeling or incentive to get out, especially earlier in the season, right? So it's kind of one example of how this can affect us. But all the other things listed here that go along with that. The sociocultural environment refers more to the interpersonal and the interpersonal and cultural setting that we find ourselves in, like social norms, cultural background, so on and so forth. Again, a basic example there is, I think I used this in the last video. Like if you're sitting in a classroom or if you're at work having a meeting with like your boss, I don't know, some professional meeting, whatever it may be, you're obviously, or typically, we're probably acting a little bit differently than we might if we're just hanging out with our best friend in the whole world, right? Because that best friend in the whole world, there's an entirely different type of relationship we have than with some coworkers that we might not know very well on a personal level, right? So it's kind of one example of how those norms can shift based off that type of environment we find ourselves in. And so with that, I want to take a moment to talk about culture, because this is a term that's used a lot that's really hard to pinpoint. If I asked you to describe like your cultural background, that's something, um, I guess it varies, but for many people, I think it can be hard to kind of put words to our cultural background. Um, and so if you think about this question, how do we assess and compare cultures? Or I guess maybe a better way to say that is how do we understand and describe cultures? There's this thing called the culture wheel that I think helps to capture that, right? In terms of, for example, the knowledge and stories that are passed along through a culture, the language that we speak, because again, that's going to affect how we interact with each other, how we make sense of the world, how we make sense of other people, we make sense of what happens to us, traditions, rituals, ceremonies, the arts, food and drink, values, so on and so forth. Something I won't spend a tremendous amount of time on in this video, but something that I wanted to mention nonetheless. And so if you'd like some more interactive stuff, here's some content for you to pause and think about. I'm using myself as an example here. And then you can further elaborate on that in this slide, and then more in this slide. Okay, let's move forward. And so you might be asking, okay, that's great and all. Okay, why does this matter? Well, it's important because in psychology and social science, everything is related to everything. People are complex, right? And so that can make research really hard, and it can make understanding, writing about, thinking about these types of things challenging as well. And so this will be the last point in this video. A quick example here to make that point. So let's say hypothetically I'm some researcher and I'm doing a study and I find that motivation is positively correlated with school performance. Correlations we'll talk about in the next video, but basically we can say that they're related, right? So what we want to think about here are what are the underlying mechanisms that can explain this relationship. And this graphic will make sense yeah, more after the next video, so I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. The point is, we find that when people are motivated, they tend to do well in school. Okay, so what's happening here, right? Well, it could be that motivation is causing performance. That makes sense, right? If you're feeling motivated, you're more likely to perform well than if you're not motivated. So that could certainly be true. Maybe motivation's causing that. Maybe the opposite's also kind of true. Maybe performance causes motivation, right? As we get feedback, we're more motivated to continue to perform well or to perform better, right? Like if I study really hard for a test, I get an A, then I'm motivated to continue that great work. I'm like, damn, I'm crushing it. Let's go get another A, right? Let's see how good we can do. So maybe that's true. Maybe it's kind of the opposite. Maybe it has nothing to do with either of those things. Maybe it's me and I'm just such a damn good teacher. I can't even say that seriously. Maybe I'm such a damn good teacher and I'm just an effective leader. And so you're motivated and you're performing well, right? So it's the result of those external forces. And maybe I'm just being an asshole and it really has nothing to do with me, right? I'll put my hubris to the side. Maybe it has everything to do with y'all. Maybe you are just very motivated and highly performing individuals. Or maybe it has something else to do with that. Maybe it's some other personality trait that's not really captured, but that relates to both of those things. Maybe I'm giving you too much credit. Maybe it just has to do with how much sleep you got the night before. All right, and so I could keep going here. Hopefully you get my point. I don't mean to belittle you. I'm sure y'all are very motivated and highly performing individuals. But point is that there's a lot of ways we can think about human behavior, and any given things we want to think about, any of these individual influences or experiences that humans might have, there's probably a lot of factors at play. And so again, this is the point I wanted to make in this video, is that if we look at any of these things in isolation, we need to consider the broader context of all the things that can affect an individual. Um, right? And so if we go back to this graphic here, just kind of my attempt to capture in a very simple, hopefully digestible way, to capture all of these influences, or how we can broadly categorize these influences. But again, we can't study all of this at once. And that's why in research, we typically have to focus in on a smaller collection of these influences or variables. But nonetheless, the story doesn't stop there. As we continue to build knowledge about human behavior, human mental processes, we need to continue building a better understanding of that bigger picture about human experiences. And that's all we got for this video. We'll see you in the next one.